Hey there, fellow philosophy enthusiast. Ready for another deep dive? We're going to tackle something today, knowing your love for getting to the bottom of things, a really fascinating development within philosophy itself.
It might even change how you think about, like, some of those core questions you're always pondering.
Exactly, those big head-scratching
We're
problems.
going deep into the world of experimental philosophy.
Oh, that's a good one. I've heard whispers about this.
Think of it as like a movement in contemporary philosophy.
Hmm,
Is it taking those classic philosophical puzzles, the ones that have been around forever, and approaching them using, get this, the tools of modern science?
that's a bold move. Science and philosophy, those are usually two separate camps.
Exactly. It's this really cool interdisciplinary field blending traditional philosophical thinking with experimental methods you'd normally find in, say, psychology or cognitive science.
So, for our listeners who, like us, love to delve into philosophical reasoning, our mission today is to really grasp this experimental turn. What's it all about?
Right. What are its big goals?
What kind of questions are experimental philosophers tackling?
And maybe the most important thing, what are the big debates and challenges surrounding this, like, relatively new way of doing philosophy?
Is it even real philosophy, some might ask?
That's a question we'll definitely get to.
Yeah.
We want to explore how this experimental approach is shaking things up,
Hmm.
impacting and interacting with the more established philosophical methods you're already familiar with.
Because we're not just sitting in our armchairs and theorizing anymore.
Right. Experimental philosophy is getting out there, collecting data, getting its hands dirty,
You love that image.
and they're using this like really diverse toolkit from surveys that capture people's instant reactions to things what philosophers call intuitions to these cleverly designed scenarios,
Ah, the thought experiments.
all the way to sophisticated techniques like measuring how quickly people respond to things or even peeking into brain activity with neuroimaging and even analyzing huge amounts of text.
So, at its heart, experimental philosophy is basically saying, hey, let's use those tools from social science to shed light on these philosophical questions that have been bugging us for centuries.
Exactly.
And a big focus, especially in the early days and even now, is the study of these so-called intuitions.
Right.
When we say intuition, we're talking about that gut feeling you get, that immediate judgment, often before you've really sat down and thought it through logically, right?
Precisely. Like,
Mhm.
this feels right, or
Mhm.
no way, that can't be true. And as you know, philosophy has always relied on these intuitions.
Oh, absolutely. Think about all those debates about knowledge in epistemology.
Right, or when we grapple with right and wrong in ethics,
Yeah, philosophers have used those gut reactions as starting points.
or even as, like, evidence for their arguments.
But here's the thing. Within analytic philosophy, which is sort of the dominant school of thought in many Western universities,
Right.
there's been this intense debate, a metaphilosophical discussion about what these intuitions are. Are they some kind of special insight into fundamental concepts?
Or are they just a way to access the properties of those concepts?
Oh.
Are they, like, totally misleading us?
Yeah.
And this is where experimental philosophy really throws a wrench in the gears.
It says, hold on, let's put these intuitions to the test.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so you've got these three broad lines of research that have emerged in experimental philosophy.
Okay.
First, there's what's called the negative program.
Negative program. Okay. What's that about?
This one's all about challenging those traditional philosophical methods that rely so heavily on intuition.
Okay.
The goal is to show that this whole reliance on intuition might be, well, shaky.
Problematic, maybe, like our intuitions could be leading us astray.
Exactly. Then you've got the second type of research, which focuses on making positive claims.
So instead of just criticizing, they're actually trying to use experimental data to build a more solid understanding of these philosophical concepts.
Exactly. They're saying, hey, let's see what these intuitions can tell us about knowledge, morality, free will, and so on.
Using empirical evidence to back it up.
I like it.
And what about the third category? What's going on there?
That's the direct study of folk thought.
Okay, folk thought. So we're getting into the minds of everyday people.
Exactly. Here, experimental philosophers are less concerned with solving those big traditional philosophical problems.
Okay.
They're more interested in how ordinary people actually think and feel about philosophical issues.
So it's less about grand theories and more about understanding the nuts and bolts of how people, actually reason about these things.
Right. It's like a snapshot of how people make sense of the world, especially in areas like moral psychology.
I see. So it's important for our listeners to remember that these three categories, the negative program, the positive claims, and the direct study of folk thought, are more like broad aims. A single research project might actually contribute to more than one of these areas.
Exactly. It's not always clear cut.
Okay, so let's dive a little deeper into this negative program you mentioned. How exactly is it challenging those fundamental assumptions about how we do philosophy?
All right, so remember, the goal here is to kind of shake our confidence in intuitions.
Right, to say maybe they're not as reliable as we thought.
And one of the main weapons in their arsenal is the argument from diversity.
Argument from diversity. Okay, break that down for us, philosophy style.
So the argument from diversity basically says that intuitions about philosophical questions, those gut feelings we talked about,
Right.
they're not universal. They actually differ, sometimes in pretty systematic ways, across groups of people.
Oh, interesting. So it's not like everyone has the same aha moment when they think about, say, free will or knowledge.
Not necessarily. These groups might be defined by culture, gender, even personality.
So, where you grew up, whether you're a man or a woman, even how extroverted you are, all these things could be shaping your intuitions.
Exactly. And this has big implications for how we do philosophy. If those bedrock intuitions we rely on aren't actually shared by everyone,
Then how can we be sure that we're even talking about the same thing?
precisely, it really calls into question the universality that we often assume about philosophical concepts.
Can you give us some, concrete examples of this diversity in action that might make a philosopher rethink their approach?
Oh, there's some fascinating studies. Early research found differences between students from East Asian and Western cultures in their responses to, classic thought experiments in epistemology.
Epistemology, that's our theory of knowledge.
Right. And in their intuitions about how proper names function, like what they actually refer to.
Interesting. So the very way we think about knowing something could differ across cultures.
Exactly. There have also been studies suggesting that men and women might have different intuitive responses to certain moral dilemmas.
That's a big one. Ethics often feels very personal and subjective.
Right. And even within a single culture, research has found links between personality traits, things like extroversion and philosophical leanings. For instance, more extroverted people tend to have more compatibilist intuitions.
Compatibilist intuitions, you're talking
Yeah.
about free will and determinism, right? Whether those two can coexist.
Exactly. So you see, the argument from diversity is saying that those intuitive flashes of insight we rely on in philosophy, they might not be so universal after all. What feels self-evident to one person or one culture could feel totally different to someone else.
Right. So what seems obvious to me might be completely counterintuitive to you. And that's a huge challenge to the idea that there are these universal bedrock intuitions that can guide our philosophical inquiry. Because if those intuitions about, say, knowledge differ so widely,
Mhm.
then how can we be confident that there's even a single objective concept of knowledge out there that those different intuitions are supposed to be tracking?
Yeah, it's like we're all trying to understand the same phenomenon, but we're using these different lenses that distort the image in all sorts of ways. Precisely. And of course, traditional philosophers haven't just ignored this challenge.
Of course not. They've got their defenses up.
Some just flat out deny that they rely on intuitions in the first place.
They're like, nope, not us. We just do pure logic and argumentation.
Exactly. They argue that philosophical justification comes from airtight arguments, not gut feelings.
Right. So the idea is that if we build our arguments carefully enough, it doesn't matter if our starting intuitions are different because the logic will lead us to the same conclusions.
But then there are others who say, okay, maybe intuitions play some role.
They're not just any intuitions.
Exactly. They argue that there might be a special class of intuitions, like those held by highly trained philosophers, that are less likely to be swayed by these cultural or personal factors.
So it's like saying there are expert intuitions that are more trustworthy than the average person's gut feelings?
Right. These philosophers have spent years and years thinking deeply about these issues, so maybe they've honed their intuitive sense to be more accurate.
I see. So maybe it's not about abandoning intuitions altogether, but about finding the right kind of intuition.
Exactly. And then you have another response, which is the idea of philosophical pluralism.
Pluralism. So the idea that there might not be one single correct answer to these big philosophical questions.
Right. Maybe there are multiple equally valid ways of understanding concepts like knowledge.
So this diversity of intuitions might actually reflect a genuine diversity in how those concepts are understood and valued across different communities.
Precisely. A pluralist might even say that this variation is a good thing. It gives us a richer picture of how different people make sense of the world.
Okay, so maybe the diversity of intuitions isn't a problem to be solved, but a reflection of the richness of human thought.
Exactly. And it's also important to remember that the initial findings about, like, widespread diversity haven't always held up when researchers try to replicate them.
Oh, really? So the picture might be more nuanced than initially thought.
Right. Some studies have failed to find those same cross-cultural differences.
Interesting.
And, even more importantly, researchers have actually found surprising areas of agreement, even across cultures, on certain philosophical intuitions.
So it's not like everyone's intuitions are completely different all the time.
Right. Like, for example, in those famous Gettier cases, the ones that challenge the traditional view of knowledge as justified true belief.
Right, where someone has a true belief for the wrong reasons.
Well, even people from vastly different backgrounds tend to agree that the person in those Gettier cases doesn't really know.
That's surprising given all this talk about diversity.
It is. It suggests that there might be some deeper shared intuitions about knowledge that transcend cultural differences.
Okay, so the argument from diversity is definitely a powerful challenge, but it's still being debated and investigated.
Right. And it's not the only weapon the negative program has.
Oh, there's more.
Yeah, they also bring out the argument from sensitivity.
Sensitivity. Okay, what's that all about?
This one focuses on how easily our intuitions can be influenced by things that seem completely irrelevant to the philosophical question at hand.
Oh, so it's not just about differences between people, but about inconsistencies within our own judgments.
Exactly.
Can you give us some examples of these irrelevant factors that might sway even a philosopher's judgment?
Think about things like whether you happen to be feeling disgusted by something.
Like if I just smelled something gross, that could affect my judgment about a philosophical dilemma?
It sounds strange, but yes, research has shown that even seemingly unrelated emotions can influence how we judge a philosophical case.
Wow.
The order in which different scenarios are presented can also make a difference.
So if I see a case where someone does something bad, before I see a case where someone does something good, that might make me judge the bad action more harshly.
It's possible. And even subtle differences in how the outcome of a situation is described can have an impact.
So it's not just about the facts of the case, but about how those facts are framed.
Exactly. And all of this raises a serious worry for anyone who relies on intuitions in their philosophical work.
Because if our intuitions are so easily swayed by these arbitrary factors, how can we trust them to reveal anything true about the world?
Right. It's like trying to navigate with a compass that's constantly being jiggled around.
You're never quite sure if you're heading in the right direction.
And this, again, has led to a lot of debate. Some philosophers, as we've seen, just deny that intuitions are that important.
They say, we don't need intuitions, we have logic.
Right. Others might argue that trained philosophers are somehow less susceptible to these fleeting influences.
Because their years of training have given them a more stable and reliable intuitive sense.
Maybe. But there's also the question of whether these effects are even that big of a deal.
Right, are we talking about subtle nudges or massive shifts in judgment?
That's a big point of contention. Some critics argue that many of the observed effects are pretty small, not enough to really undermine our confidence in intuitions.
So maybe it's just a bit of noise in the system, not a fundamental flaw.
Possibly. But in other cases, these contextual factors have been shown to lead to pretty significant changes in judgment. So it really depends on the specific case and the specific factor.
Okay, so it's a complex issue, as most things in philosophy are. And even if these factors do influence our judgments, is that always a bad thing?
That's a great point. Some philosophers argue that the context might actually provide us with relevant information that helps us make better judgments.
So, the context isn't always irrelevant noise, it might be giving us valuable clues.
Exactly. And then there's research suggesting that we might have internal resources, like our confidence levels, that can help us distinguish between those intuitions that are more likely to be trustworthy and those that are more fleeting and unreliable.
So maybe it's not about ignoring context or denying the role of intuitions, but about being more sophisticated in how we use them.
Precisely.
Okay, so the negative program has definitely thrown down the gauntlet, challenging some core assumptions about how we do philosophy. Now, let's move on to how experimental philosophy is actually engaging with some of those big philosophical topics like free will.
Free will and moral responsibility, a classic philosophical puzzle.
One that's been debated for centuries. So how are experimental philosophers approaching this age-old problem?
Well, a lot of the work is focused on our intuitions about compatibilism versus incompatibilism.
Okay, remind us what those terms mean.
Compatibilism is the view that free will and determinism can coexist.
So even if our actions are determined by prior events and the laws of nature,
We can still have genuine freedom and be held morally responsible for our choices.
and incompatibilism is the opposite.
Right. Incompatibilists say that if determinism is true, then free will goes out the window, and we can't really be held responsible for our actions.
So why all this focus on intuitions in the free will debate?
Because some philosophers who argue for incompatibilism rely on a certain intuition,
Which is?
that it just doesn't feel right that we could be both determined and free. It feels like those two things are in conflict.
Right, like if everything I do is predetermined, then how can I be truly free?
Exactly. So experimental philosophers wanted to see, is this intuition actually widespread?
Mm.
Do most people share this feeling that determinism rules out free will?
Okay, and what did they find?
Well, some of the early studies actually seem to support compatibilism. They presented people with scenarios where the universe was clearly deterministic.
So everything was preordained.
Right. But they then asked whether individuals within those deterministic scenarios could still act freely and be held responsible for their choices.
And people said yes.
Surprisingly, many of them did. For example, in one famous study, they described a supercomputer that could perfectly predict someone's future actions. Like it knows everything they're going to do.
Okay, that sounds pretty deterministic.
It is. But then they asked, if this person, whose actions are predictable, robs a bank, are they morally responsible?
So even though their actions were predetermined by the supercomputer, people still felt like they were responsible.
Many of them did, which suggests that maybe the intuitive pull towards incompatibilism isn't as strong as some philosophers thought.
So early on, it seemed like maybe people's intuitions actually aligned more with compatibilism.
Right. But, of course, the research didn't stop there.
Of course not. There's always more to the story. So what happened next?
Later studies started to tweak those scenarios, describing determinism in more detail, really emphasizing its causal and inevitable nature.
So they made it clear that there was absolutely no way to escape the predetermined path.
Exactly. And when they asked more abstract questions like, is free will generally possible in a deterministic universe, people tended to lean towards incompatibilism.
So the way the question was phrased, whether it was a concrete story or a more abstract question, actually influenced people's intuitions.
Exactly. And what's even more interesting is that this shift towards incompatibilist intuitions in those more abstract scenarios has been found across different cultures.
So it's not just a Western thing. People all over the world seem to have this intuition that determinism and free will might be fundamentally incompatible.
Right. But then the question becomes, what explains this apparent inconsistency? Why are people compatibilists in some cases and incompatibilists in others?
Right. We need a theory to explain these different intuitions.
And one influential theory is called the error theory.
Error theory. Okay. What's the error?
The error, according to this theory, is that people often misunderstand what determinism actually means.
Okay.
They interpret determinism as meaning that our mental states, our thoughts, desires, intentions,
The stuff that makes us us.
they see it as having no causal impact on our actions.
So it's like our minds are completely bypassed by the deterministic chain of events.
Right, like we're just along for the ride.
I see. So if people believe that determinism entails this kind of mental bypassing, then it makes sense why they'd reject free will.
Exactly. Because it feels like we're not really in control if our minds are just being dragged along by some predetermined force.
Right. But the important thing is that determinism, as philosophers usually understand it,
Doesn't necessarily imply that kind of bypassing.
so the error theory is saying that these incompatibilist intuitions are based on a mistaken understanding of what determinism really means.
Exactly. And there's some experimental evidence to support this. When people are presented with descriptions of a deterministic universe, many of them will agree with statements like, what a person wants has no effect on what they end up doing.
So they're basically saying that our desires and intentions are irrelevant in a deterministic world.
Right. Which suggests that they're interpreting determinism in a way that rules out mental causation.
But of course, there are always counter-arguments.
Always.
So what do the critics of the error theory say?
They say that maybe it's the other way around.
What do you mean?
Maybe people first have this strong intuition that determinism rules out free will,
Okay.
and then they try to make sense of that intuition by coming up with this idea of mental bypassing.
So it's not that they misunderstand determinism, but that their initial intuition about free will is shaping how they understand determinism.
Exactly. They're trying to come up with an explanation for why they feel so strongly that determinism and free will can't coexist.
Interesting. So it's like a chicken and egg problem. Which comes first, the intuition or the interpretation?
Right. And there's actually some research using statistical causal modeling that supports this alternative explanation.
So the debate is still ongoing.
Absolutely. And then there's the question of those early compatibilist
Hmm.
intuitions. Remember, those were the ones triggered by those concrete scenarios.
Right, like the supercomputer example. So have those intuitions been challenged as well?
Oh, yeah. One early theory was that these compatibilist judgments were just driven by emotional responses.
So, like, we feel sympathy for the person in the scenario, even though we know their actions are predetermined.
Exactly. But a huge meta-analysis, which combined the results of many different studies, found little evidence to support this emotional influence theory.
So it's not just about our heartstrings being pulled.
Probably not. Another argument against those compatibilist intuitions is that some people seem to affirm free will even in clearly fatalistic scenarios,
Fatalistic meaning.
meaning that the outcome is inevitable no matter what the person chooses.
So even if someone's choices are completely irrelevant to what happens, people still say they have free will.
Some people do, which suggests that they might not be fully grasping the constraints of determinism.
Right. It's like saying, I have free will to choose to fly, even though I know I can't physically fly.
Exactly. But even in those fatalistic scenarios, there's a subtle distinction to be made.
Oh,
Follow-up research found that even those who affirmed free will in those fatalistic situations still tended to believe that the source of the action came from within the agent.
so even though they couldn't change the outcome, they still saw the action as originating from the agent's own choices and desires.
Right. This is sometimes called source compatibilism.
So it's like saying, yeah, I might not be able to control what ultimately happens, but the action is still mine in some sense.
Exactly. So the current view, based on all this experimental work, is that people probably have both compatibilist and incompatibilist intuitions.
So it's not a simple either.
Right. And the specific factors that trigger one type of intuition versus the other.
Are still being investigated.
Precisely. It's a complex and fascinating puzzle.
It is. Now let's turn to another area where experimental philosophy has been making waves. The impact of moral judgments on other, seemingly non-moral judgments.
This is a really interesting line of research. It's looking at how our moral evaluations of the situation can actually influence our judgments about things that seem purely factual or descriptive.
Okay, give us an example. How can my moral judgment affect my perception of like what actually happened?
Think about intention. Did someone intend to cause a certain outcome?
Right, that seems like a straightforward factual question. Either they intended it or they didn't.
You'd think so. But research suggests that our moral judgments can actually color our perception of intention.
Really? So if I think someone did something morally wrong, I'm more likely to say they intended to do it.
Exactly. There's this famous example called the Nobi effect.
Nobi effect.
Imagine a company director who knows that a new policy will harm the environment as a side effect,
Okay.
but their main goal is to increase profits. Now, the question is, did the director intentionally harm the environment?
Well, it depends. If they knew it would harm the environment and went ahead anyway.
Right. But here's the thing. People are much more likely to say the director intentionally harmed the environment.
If the environmental harm is seen as morally bad.
Exactly. Compared to a scenario where the side effect, to the same extent, is morally good. Like it helps the environment.
So even though the director's knowledge and actions are the same in both cases,
Our moral judgment about the outcome is influencing whether we say they intended it.
that's wild. It's like our moral compass is somehow distorting our perception of what happened.
It's as if our moral judgments are leaking into our factual judgments.
And this Nobi effect, it's not just limited to judgments about intention, is it?
No, it pops up in other areas too, like whether we say someone knew about a bad outcome.
So if something bad happens, we're more likely to say the person involved knew it was going to happen, even if they didn't have much evidence.
Exactly. And the same thing happens with judgments about happiness.
So we're less likely to say someone is happy if we think they've lived a morally bad life.
Right, even if they seem to be enjoying themselves. And the effect has been found in judgments about causation, action individuation, and even how we apply gradable adjectives.
Wow, so this moral contamination is pretty pervasive. What are the implications of all this for philosophy?
On one level, each of these specific effects is relevant to those areas of philosophy that deal with those concepts. Intention, knowledge, causation, happiness, All of those are things philosophers think about a lot.
Right, so it's giving us new insights into the nature of those concepts.
Exactly. But on a deeper level, this whole phenomenon raises really profound questions about human cognition itself.
About how our minds work.
Right. It suggests that our intuitive ways of thinking about the world might be deeply intertwined with our moral sensibilities.
So it's not like we have this separate moral faculty that judges things as good or bad, and then we have this separate objective faculty that judges what's true or false.
Right. It seems like those two things are much more interconnected than we might have thought.
So naturally, researchers want to understand why these effects occur.
Of course, always looking for explanations.
What are some of the leading contenders?
There are a few different camps. One possibility is that these effects aren't really driven by moral judgment at all.
Okay.
Maybe there are other subtle differences between those scenarios with good outcomes and those with bad outcomes.
Differences that we're not even consciously aware of.
Right. And maybe those differences are what's really driving our judgments, not the moral aspect.
Interesting. So it's like a hidden variable problem.
Exactly. Another set of explanations says that moral judgment is the driving force,
Okay.
but it represents some kind of error in our reasoning,
So we're letting our moral biases cloud our judgment.
potentially. One idea is that it's a form of motivated cognition,
Motivated cognition meaning.
meaning that we're unconsciously motivated to see the world in a way that confirms our existing beliefs and values.
So if we believe someone is a bad person,
We're more likely to interpret their actions as intentional and blameworthy, even if the evidence is ambiguous.
I see. So it's like we're bending the facts to fit our moral narrative.
Right. Then there's the view that these effects aren't really about distorted concepts, but about how we use language in social contexts.
So it's not that our concepts of intention or knowledge are messed up, but that we're using those words differently depending on the situation.
Exactly. Like saying someone intended a bad side effect might be more about expressing moral disapproval than making a literal claim about their mental state.
So it's a way of saying this was a really bad thing to do without necessarily saying they consciously planned to do this bad thing.
Right. And then finally, there's the possibility that moral judgment plays a genuine role in how we actually apply these concepts.
So it's not just about language or bias, but about the very nature of the concepts themselves.
Right. Maybe our concept of happiness is inherently value-laden.
So we can't even think about happiness without considering whether someone deserves to be happy.
Possibly. Or maybe moral considerations play a role in how we think about counterfactuals, which are crucial for understanding intention and causation.
Counterfactuals, those what-if thoughts.
Exactly. Like, what if they had done things differently? Would the outcome have been the same? Our moral judgments might influence how we answer those questions.
It's fascinating how much complexity there is in these seemingly simple judgments.
It is. And it's a great example of how experimental philosophy is bringing together different disciplines to tackle these questions.
Right, it's not just armchair philosophy anymore.
It's philosophy informed by psychology, linguistics, and even neuroscience.
Okay, so we've seen how experimental philosophy is challenging traditional views of intuitions and shedding new light on classic philosophical problems like free will and the relationship between moral and non-moral judgments.
Right.
Now, let's turn our attention to epistemology, our theory of knowledge, and see what experimental methods are revealing about our intuitions in that domain.
Sounds good. So in experimental epistemology, there's been a lot of work focusing on how ordinary people attribute knowledge in different situations.
So, like, when do we say someone really knows something?
Exactly. And as we discussed earlier, this research is directly relevant to that negative program critique of relying on intuitions.
Right, the idea that our intuitions about knowledge might not be as reliable as we thought.
Exactly. But experimental epistemologists aren't just focused on debunking things. They're also interested in specific questions about how we understand knowledge.
Okay, give us an example. What's one of those specific questions they're investigating?
One really interesting question is about the role of stakes in our knowledge attribution.
The stakes. What do you mean?
It's about whether the practical importance of a situation affects whether we're willing to say someone knows something.